Good morning to all of you. Welcome back to day two, second day of the March board meeting. Thank you for coming back to this room. Thank you for those attending virtually. Sadia Adam, welcome again. And Dave Sullivan from PIOB, who I already see on the screen and who will be with us today. Welcome, Dave, and thank you for joining us at this meeting. Thank you also to the observers, those who are here in person and those who may be observing us virtually. Today we have another busy day ahead of us. I can't help but saying that yesterday was a very, very special day for this board. I think it was really the kickoff of not only of a new work stream, but a new approach, and I would say almost a new era for the IESBA. And I'm very, very grateful to the task or the working group for having offered us such great opportunities to listen to such great presenters, but also to the board members for the good discussion that we had, and we could see the ideas coming in, and being clear that we have a great challenge ahead, but also a great and unique opportunity. So today we will start with a presentation on technology. The first slot of this morning will be on the work of the technology working group, and we will receive a presentation from Jason Bradley, who is the Director of Standard Setting and Oversight at the Accounting and Financial Reporting Council, Hong Kong. And thank you, Jason. I don't know if you are already with us. Anyway, I'm going to give the floor to David Clark, also thanking beforehand David for having taken this work forward and for taking care of this working group, which had suffered some changes over time, but that David and the working group is still keeping alive and kicking. So thank you, David, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gabriella, and thanks again to the board for the opportunity to report back on Technology Working Group. Just as a reminder, the Technology Working Group is made up of Paul Mathura, and we have an additional star appearance, I suppose. Joining our group is David Ray, who's already joined a couple of our meetings already prior to his inaugural board meeting. So thanks for that, David. We continue to have fantastic support from Jean on my left here and Linda Biek from the IESBA executive. And of course, myself as chair as well. I'd like to remind everyone that this is an important year for the IESBA, not just because we're working towards an end game on sustainability assurance, but also it is the effective year of our technology provisions as well. And there will be some upscaled activity in respect of outreach and communication towards that, and we'll get a little bit of that from Jean later on today. Next slide, please. Yeah, today we'll bring you an update on some of the sessions we've had since our September report back. Just as a reminder, we've had 2 virtual technology expert group meetings and 3 TWG meetings. We are taking you through some of the case studies that we continue to develop. And John and I would like to brief you on some of the steps forward, coupled with some insights from the results of a survey that you kindly took part in as board members and technical advisors over the last few days. And just as we contemplate the regulatory awakening in respect of AI, and there certainly has been a bit of a regulatory awakening in the advent of executive orders, AI Acts, the G7's Hiroshima process, the labeling of AI as AI content as synthetic, international guiding principles, and various recommendations on the ethics of AI. We are, of course, as Gabriella pointed out, super excited to bring another educational piece from a very active technology expert group member in Jason Bradley from the AFRC, basically on what's happening in the regulatory space. We had planned to step away from AI for this board meeting, but of course the world still continues to advance with AI after crossing the technological Rubicon, and it's clear that the world remains very focused on AI, and as such, we will do likewise. We'll bring you some focus on another technology in June, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. At both of our technology expert group meetings, we honed on our case studies, and this slide is really a reference to those case studies. They've gained some real traction, and we're almost at fruition in respect of them. Jean will present how we take them forward in due course. Word of caution, however, I think, as we focus on these, it will be prudent as a technology working group, but also as a board, not to forget about other emerging and slowly smouldering technologies such as quantum computing, because once something like that takes off, it will explode just like it has done for AI. That said, quite a lot of our focus has been naturally on AI. One of our TEG members put forward that AI today is no different from any other industrial revolution we had. It's going to, if it hasn't already, impact and change everything, every single industry, the way we do everything. And I would rather think that extends to how we think about due care, objectivity, transparency, professional competence and integrity, plus accountability, which of course a lot of our case studies focus on, not just within the remit of AI. The TEG have been super helpful in drafting the case studies you see here, and they threaded them together in such a way that there are obvious commonalities and interplay. For example, the use of AI in cyber risk and the fraud space, with our TEG cautioning that with AI, we now all need to be super focused as bad actors play with AI with malfeasance in mind. To use Amarjeet's point yesterday, this is a speed of change that really does not allow too much reflection, but instead a lot of action. The TEG also spoke about the hallucinogenic nature of AI, which continues, I should say, to get things wrong, and the importance of the human in the loop for the journey of AI. And how, again, the responsibility does not lie with the technology, but with the users themselves. We contemplated the use of technology sold to non-audit clients with user interfaces designed by firms that are unsold to audit clients and how this might affect independence. The TEG also stated that whilst firms and organizations scramble to launch AI solutions, regulations and guidance does seem to remain behind the curve somewhat. It was pointed out that firms and organizations who use third-party technologies may not know that they are already exposed to AI and its associated risks, as the third parties embed AI into their technologies. So a kind of a word of warning really to make sure you read underlying terms and conditions as you deploy third-party technologies. One of our TEG participants underlined the imbalance between focus on ethics versus market value, the illustration being that OpenAI, ChatGPT creators, lost confidence and ousted their CEO not long ago and co-founder because they felt things were developing too fast towards something that was not safe for humanity. But they very quickly brought him back in after most of their LEAP programmers threatened to resign, and that was something that would almost certainly have destroyed their market value. Other contributions from the TEG include a statement that whilst there is much focus on standards and ESG and sustainability assurance, there is probably not enough thought going towards standards for the performance of AI assurance. On blockchain, TEG posed the question, what are the independence concerns around operating the node on the blockchain, and can auditors take blockchain data and rely on blockchain explorers, or do they have to have their own node and ticket themselves? As an aside, the AICPA in January have launched some very useful guidance in respect of this, and our case studies will also focus on addressing some of these things too. More to come as we think about the utilization and release of the case studies, but the direction of travel we have is that it will form hopefully a basis of a much fresher way of delivering non-authoritative material as we try to grab the attention in the age of information oversupply. A bit more of this from Jean amongst some other things, and I shall hand over the baton to her.
Thanks, David, and good morning to everybody. You can go on to the next slide, please. So as we had our discussions with the technology experts group, we asked them to expand on the scenarios a little bit more, to give us a little bit of more insight or meat around the bones of just having a statement. With that, we also requested them to provide some questions that people out there or professional accountants might want to have answered. This is the building blocks of our case studies. And to bring this to life, we want to bring this in short, bite-sized snippets to the market through LinkedIn posts or short 2 to 3 minute interviews. We will engage our technology experts group members to answer these questions that is kind of burning around these specific topics. We currently have 16 case studies. And as David has mentioned, we will keep on building on these case studies over the period of time as we develop and expanding on them as well. Including in the next steps as well is that the exploring the of the IESBA code, we had such huge success. During last year, June, when our marketing team provided kind of a series of understanding the fundamental principles and the threats. And we really want to build on those success with the technology as well. And as we ramp up on our engagement with the provisions becoming effective at the end of this year. In addition, as you would be aware, the Exploring of the IESBA Code has a section which was developed on a focus on the technology, artificial intelligence. We're aimed to update this Exploring the IESBA Code and also looking at other potential topics as we look at our scenarios that might complement the suite of the Exploring the IESBA Code. And things that come to mind is like blockchain and cybersecurity, which is kind of the burning point at the moment. But I'm running ahead of the results, so just wait a little bit for that. If we can go to the next slide, please. So thank you very much for all the board members and the technical advisors that provided us with your views on what you see as the technologies you see as today as having the biggest impact on the profession. I know we asked specifically what these technologies are for today, with the aim of maybe coming back to the board at a later stage this year and asking you what you see the future technologies are impacting the profession. We asked those questions to kind of double check and see if the scenarios that we have is on par. Are we addressing the concerns that is being raised by the public out there? And we started with the board. We will do a similar poll using LinkedIn and asking our audience as well, or the people that we engage with in LinkedIn, of what their views are on some of these technologies. So if you're on LinkedIn, to partake in this survey or the poll again. So as mentioned, we aim to kind of get these results to you and making sure that we're addressing all the topics. But we asked the same question to the technology experts group. So you would ask why we did that. So obviously we asked them at every technology experts group meeting, what are the burning emerging technologies out there? So we kind of want to make a sense check and seeing that we're on par as well. So that's why we have that results. And we'll show in a slide, in the deck that we shared initially, there was a lot of dots. So we have the results in and we'll share that result shortly. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So this is the results that we received from our board members and technical advisors and official observers. So first came in cybersecurity and secondly, artificial intelligence. Interesting, and I spoke to David just before the meeting, as earlier, end of last week, it was actually the other way around, artificial intelligence being first and then cybersecurity, highlighting that both of these topics are burning issues at the moment. It's understandable that cybersecurity is front of mind with all the ransomware, data breaches, and phishing emails, I think, that we almost receive on a daily basis. And artificial intelligence, obviously, and nothing needs to be said in addition to that. The third one, which is cloud computing, I found very interesting here as well. And reflecting on that point is actually with the head of COVID, forced a lot of practices to kind of go to the cloud, whether it used to be maybe going into the office. So that's definitely a huge spike in cloud computing. And then blockchain and digital assets, a topic that we're aiming to bring to the board as well. Something that David mentioned around quantum as one of the questions was to say how you would see quantum computing. It did not make the top 5, but it actually coming in at a close number 6, where more than half of the participants rated it 6 and higher. So it's definitely a space to watch out for. Other topics that was also raised by the different survey respondents were digitalization of financial and non-financial reporting, XBRL, and digital signatures. And interesting, these are 2 new case studies that was added as well through our latest engagement with the TEG. 2 other points is also the impacts of regulations on big tech, as well as data analytics and Internet of Things. If we go on to the next slide, just a repeat of the first one. And if we go just one more click, please, bringing in the results of the technology experts group. So cloud computing and cybersecurity are equal in the number of importance, and that's why there's that star. You would see that all 5 are exactly the same, but in a different order, with artificial intelligence coming in 3rd, and digital assets and blockchain both honing on the last 2 as well. So as we move forward with the work of the technology working group, we will look at these topics going forward and see that we bring these topics to life as we ramp up for the provisions becoming effective at the end of the year. David, if I can hand back to you to speak a little bit about what we're planning for next month, next board meeting.
Thank you, John. That's the first time I'm seeing these results myself, and I think they speak volumes. Next slide. All right. So at the moment, or we had been, gearing up to bring an educational piece in June on blockchain. We'll revisit that again this afternoon as we meet as the TWG. It might still be the right topic to look at, but we might have to think about cyber as well, or some of the important technologies that appear in this the survey. We're thinking about something a bit more interactive in June as well. We're thinking about a panel session, maybe bring in a couple of folks to the table where we can obviously ask them questions back and forth, and maybe they can pose questions themselves too. But there'll be more to come on this. I'll just now, Jason, just a 2-minute warning, but I'd like to obviously introduce our speaker today, Jason Bradley, who is the Director of Standard Setting and Oversight at the Accounting and Financial Reporting Council in Hong Kong, an IESBA technology experts group, but up until very recently was the head of assurance technology at the FRC in the UK. His interest in technology is wide-ranging, but focuses primarily on how emerging technologies can be deployed in the accounting profession to improve quality and better serve the public interest. So Jason, thank you very much for being here today, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, David. Hopefully everyone can hear me, just give me a shout if not. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is kind of drawing on my experience, both as the kind of former head of assurance technology at the FRC, and then some new work that I've been working on here in Hong Kong at the AFRC. I'm going to start out with a little bit of definitional work, just because before I go into the details of AI regulation, one of the interesting things to pull out is what do people actually mean when they're talking about AI. I'll do a little bit on comparing jurisdictions and looking at different ways of potentially regulating something like AI, and kind of pull out some key messages, I think, both for professional accountants in practice and in business, but as well as looking at that, thinking about how standard setters and regulators, professional bodies, everyone in the kind of professional accounting ecosystem can work together to make sure that the benefits of AI are realized, and hopefully we can mitigate the risks of AI use as much as possible. If we do the next slide, please. Thanks. So as I mentioned, I think defining AI before I kind of delve into the detail of AI regulation is really important, particularly because there still isn't really any particular definitive definition of AI. They all have some common characteristics. Generally, it's about replicating some element of human intelligence, reasoning, or decision-making. And in fact, it kind of brings up the first problem with AI regulation, which is if you kind of do a deep dive into the different jurisdictions and their potential approaches to AI regulation, there's not always a consistent definition of AI. If I take the UK, for example, how AI is defined in the government's recent sort of framework, you could probably argue that some tools that most people would consider AI might fall outside the definition. And you could probably, with a little bit of effort, make some tools that people don't necessarily consider AI fit within that definition. So I think it's really important just to bear in mind when we're talking through some of these issues that the actual technology we're talking about may vary slightly across different jurisdictions. It's also worth picking out, I think, machine learning as a sort of subset of AI very specifically, primarily because a lot of the tools that we see professional accountants either using in practice or are starting to look at developing are generally based on machine learning tools, machine learning techniques. Essentially, you can boil machine learning down to it's a set of algorithms that finds patterns in some kind of sample data and then can use what it has learned about sample data to make predictions about new data it's given. ChatGPT is probably the kind of most well-known of the machine learning tools. Essentially, it's created a statistical model of language. It's learned from a data set, and then you can ask it to create new data that has similar characteristics. So, write me a novel or write me a story. And ultimately, a lot of the tools that we see focus on that machine learning side, primarily because they're usually designed to perform a specific function for a specific type of data set. So you can see how those kinds of machine learning tools would fit very nicely into what a lot of professional accountants do. If you take audit, for example, and you wanted to use a machine learning tool to help you look for fraud, there's a lot of available transactional data you could train a tool on. And essentially what you're then asking the algorithm to do is say, well, based on everything you've learned, here's a new journal listing, make predictions about where the fraud most likely is in this data set. So those kind of techniques fit quite nicely into a lot of the work that professional accountants do. And so I think it's worth kind of pulling that out as a sort of distinct subset of AI. Can we go on to the next slide, please? I thought it would also be worth kind of pulling out a couple of key tools that we've either seen actively deployed by audit firms or some tools that are in development by professional accountants, and split it really by kind of three main categories. Something that is quite on the forefront of a lot of preparers' minds are financial reporting tools. So quite often, again, it's about using machine learning tools to make predictions. And one of the ways that can be really helpful is if you have some kind of disclosure or numerical, amount that needs to be included in the accounts that you might historically have used a more traditional statistics model for. A lot of machine learning tools can help support those. So the most, I say classic, but it's probably a bit early to call anything a classic in this space, is the use of machine learning tools to support the calculation of expected credit loss calculations when you are doing disclosures for IFRS 9. It's kind of the perfect scenario for using a machine learning tool. You've got a lot of available data, you're asking it to make a prediction. The other thing that we've kind of started to see people talk a lot about is the use of language models in the preparation of disclosures. So using tools like ChatGPT to help prepare first drafts of disclosures. We'll talk a really interesting topic, I think, that's worth exploring at some point in the future is really considering the kind of risks involved in using language models to prepare disclosures and how the kind of inherent issues with bias can create problems with, whether a disclosure is really helpful for the people that are using the accounts. We can also talk about assurance tools. So that's probably the one that interests me the most personally. Generally, again, we're talking about machine learning tools, and they're often looking at things like anomaly detection and pattern recognition, which are two kinds of machine learning techniques that fit nicely into a lot of the work that particularly auditors do. So as I mentioned earlier, looking for unusual patterns in journal postings might help indicate where there's been fraud or an error. So a set of tools there that is really being worked on by a lot of firms. There's a couple of firms in particular that have been developing suites of tools. where they've worked with third-party technology providers to create tools that make use of a number of machine learning algorithms at once to present to auditors potentially interesting or anomalous or unusual postings or numbers that just don't look right. The interesting thing with those assurance tools is because of how the machine learning tools are trained, it allows the tools to pick out things that are unusual for that specific population. So rather than having to have a professional accountant tell the tool, pick out journals that are round or pick out numbers that are posted on Saturday, the tools actually pull out things that are unusual for that specific population that might be a little bit too subtle for a person to detect, but a powerful algorithm, with a lot of computing power behind it, might be able to do a better job of pulling out unusual things. There's also practice support tools, so tools that support professional accountants in things such as AML risk identification, which are also, emerging tools and technologies that could help with the kind of more administrative side of things for professional accountants and running their business, as well as actually doing the work that they need to do for clients. If we move on to the next slide, please. I thought it was also worth pulling out, kind of before I dived into the different approaches to regulation, why it's so important to think about AI regulation. I think we've kind of reached a point where a large number of people, perhaps even the majority, agree that there are huge upside potential when it comes to the use of AI. There are things that AI tools can do in a more effective way, a more efficient way, but there are lots of potential risks as well. And I think that is where sensible and appropriate regulation really starts to come into the picture, which is to ask the question essentially is, as a society and specifically for us and for IESBA as professional accountants, how can we realize the majority of the benefits of those AI tools whilst minimizing the most significant risks? I think if I was to pull out 3 risks that are most likely to impact, certainly on tools that professional accountants are thinking about, I think bias is a particularly important one. To take a really specific example, if you're training a machine learning tool, to pick out anomalous transactions, and you've only trained it on data that relates to, I don't know, the banking sector, essentially you've built bias into that tool. It's only learned about how transactions work in the banking sector. If you then applied that tool to a client in the energy sector or to any other potential scenario, it's probably not going to tell you anything that helpful. It's not necessarily going to understand the transaction paths. And so what's really interesting there then is that in developing and training that tool, professional accountants can even themselves introduce bias into the AI systems. A kind of common one, I think, and David sort of touched on it a bit, with some of the hallucinogenic qualities of large language model outputs are concerns with output quality. Tools such as ChatGPT sometimes simply are not correct. They, introduce misleading information, fake references, things of that nature. And I think concerns with output quality is a really important one. Fundamentally, an AI and a machine learning algorithm is a tool. And if the output of that tool is of poor quality, the question really then becomes, well, how much should a professional accountant use it in their work? I think something that's likely to develop a little bit over time is potential over-reliance on tools. So you can certainly envision a future where, as some of the tools that we see in development become more sophisticated, easier to use, and more commonplace, that is there a risk that professional accountants will cease to be critical enough of the tool? Does this start to potentially introduce concerns around professional accountants' ability to apply professional skepticism and apply their own judgment to situations? So I think overall, AI regulation is really important so we can get the best out of tools. It can also go badly wrong. Although it's not related to accountancy, in 2020, the UK government introduced a tool onto its website CIBot, which was designed to give advice on COVID-19 matters. It had to eventually be taken down, though, because the tool gave inaccurate information on things like transmission and severity. And so the tool had to be taken down. And I think that goes to show where you've got to be very careful with these kinds of tools, because they can easily create problems that you may not have envisioned when you originally created them. So I think from my perspective, getting AI regulation right, hopefully on the first time, is a really vital part of making sure that the benefits can be realized and the risks are mitigated. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So what I'm going to spend the majority of time sort of talking about now is thinking about different approaches that jurisdictions have taken to AI regulation. I'd say that you can generalize approaches to AI regulation across a spectrum from very focused on principles to very focused on legislation. The appendix to this contains much more detail on the various jurisdictions, but you can sort of have a look at that later if you'd like to get additional information. But I'll pick out a kind of a few key ones. I mean, perhaps the biggest news from an AI legislation perspective is the AI Act in the EU. Very focused on legislation, very focused on mitigating harm and protecting fundamental rights. Categorization of systems, so looking at high-risk systems that need to adhere to really strict controls and try to protect fundamental human rights. I'd say if I was, going to pick one, it's probably the most stringent. Well, I would say it is the most stringent set of rules in place for AI at the moment. China has also taken quite a legislative-focused approach to AI regulation. Rather than a wider sort of general AI Act like the EU, the approach in China has been to focus very much on individual technologies as they emerge and legislate very quickly for specific technologies. So, for example, foundational models have to register with the government before they can be released to the public. That's a very kind of still legislation focused, but very focused on specific technologies as they emerge. So rather than setting out a general framework, being quite focused on identifying immediate risk and responding to that. If I was to go to the other end of the spectrum, the UK and Japan have taken similar approaches, where they're not necessarily introducing lots of additional legislation, but it's really focused on principles, thinking about safety and security, transparency, accountability. So rather than saying, these are high-risk systems, you must do this, these systems are banned and these are not, it's an approach that's much more focused on really putting the power in the hands of people that are looking to deploy and use tools and saying, if you are going to be using these kinds of tools, that is potentially highly beneficial. There's a lot there from an innovation perspective, but there are obviously issues that need to be carefully addressed. The situation in Hong Kong is more towards the principles-focused one at the moment. There are some existing legislation that's relevant around things like data protection, making sure there's no bias in relation to protecting characteristics for individuals. And the Hong Kong Monetary Authority has published some high-level principles on artificial intelligence, which includes overarching principles on how regulated entities might think about deploying AI. I kind of put IESBA there as well on the principles-focused end of it, because I think that very much sits kind of, in IESBA's approach to putting things together, which is to really focus on the principles. I think ultimately most AI risk most AI regulation is going to be about trying to balance that risk. There are some benefits to legislation-focused approaches, and there are some benefits to principles-focused approaches that I'll kind of touch on in a moment. But I really think the ultimate question most people are trying to answer is, what is the best way we can ensure that AI is used safely, whilst also making sure that we maintain as pro-innovation stance as possible? Can we move to the next slide, please? occasionally people have asked me which of kind of, the two extremes or where along that spectrum is the best place to be from an AI regulation perspective. Is there a quote unquote best way of regulating AI? My personal view is I think that either approach can be made to work, and that one is not necessarily better than the other. It can depend as much on the actual tool or algorithm you're talking about. What I will tend to say is I think that principles-focused approaches can often be a little bit more responsive. So where you have really specifically worded legislation, if someone develops a new tool tomorrow and that really specifically worded legislation doesn't cover it, you can be in an unusual situation where new technology each day or each week that it's created is kind of running ahead of your ability to set legislation, to create new laws. So the principles-focused approach to say, well, these kinds of tools, you need to abide by core principles, I think allows, at least in my view, a greater coverage, because if you set some principles on day one, as long as they're sensible and well thought through, those principles will apply on day 3, day 5, and, until there's some huge kind of, gigantic shift in how a technology is deployed. The principles, I think, tend to be, more long lasting. I often think the principles-based approach can lead to more proportionate outcomes. Where you've got an extremely high risk tool, you can really drill down into the core principles and design a response that's appropriate to the level of risk. Where you have very low risk tools, and most of the tools that we see professional accountants use, if you were to kind of slot them into the EU's kind of hierarchy of risk for tools, most of the tools professional accountants are talking about are relatively low risk. We're not generally talking about tools that make medical decisions or things of that nature. I also think that the principles-focused approach, so really setting out some core ideas for people to consider when they're developing tools, is that it can better promote innovation. I think it's easier for people that are developing tools to see how they might be able to fit their tool in an environment which is, looking at mitigating risk, but is also saying, well, these principles apply, but we are interested in encouraging innovation and looking at new ways of doing things. I mean, I suspect perhaps the biggest risk, sometimes leveled at a very, very high level principles-focused approach, is, does it fully mitigate the most significant risks? If you only have principles with no specific, legislation or no specific requirements for, particularly high risk approaches, does it fully mitigate the most significant risk to society? The other, and I think really interesting one from a professional accountant's perspective, is it can lead to differing interpretations across the same sector. As we're all aware, when you take a principles-based approach, one of the potential concerns with it is that different people think it means different things. I might think that transparency means one thing from a tool's perspective. 10 other individuals will probably have 10 other opinions on what transparency means to them. So, the principles-focused approach, I think, has a lot of positives, which is not to say that I don't think there are also benefits from a legislation-focused approach. It's probably much easier to directly address specific risks. If you've got a specific tool that someone is deploying in a jurisdiction and it's obviously having a detrimental effect, or it's, producing problematic results, if you can respond quickly with legislation, then you can usually clearly define the rules and goals. There's likely to be less interpretation in those scenarios. However, one of the big issues of that is it's very quickly outdated, as we've mentioned. It can be a time-consuming process, setting legislation, and depending on what jurisdiction you're in, that can be months, even years after the fact. So I think my worry with a purely legislation-focused approach is that if you take 2 or 3 years to develop legislation, 2 or 3 years in the AI space might as well be 30 or 40 years, when it comes to how quickly the technology is moving on. So I think that's really just to lay out some of of kind of what I've seen when I've been looking through all these kinds of regulations and different approaches, really trying to just lay out what some of the positives and negatives might be. I think ultimately, probably a mix of both approaches is likely to be the most helpful. I think for the vast, at least, in my personal opinion, I think in the vast majority of cases, a principles-focused approach makes a lot of sense. It allows for an innovative regime, an innovative way of looking at the use of AI. But at the same time, some specific legislation where we're talking about systematic risk to populations, some specific legislation might make sense in some way. I also think that's, to me, a very proportionate way of addressing it. You are the majority of the time trusting people to think about those principles and really consider for themselves how they can appropriately design tools and mitigate risks and as well as promoting innovation. But at the same time, you're really kind of underpinning that there are some things with which the risk is just so great to society that we need to really think about a specific set of legislation for it. So I think to kind of answer the question that's often been posed to me of which is the best, I think it's kind of an unanswerable question. I think a mixture of both is probably the most sensible approach. Can I have the next slide, please? I think if I was going to pick out from all of the various kinds of legislation and all of the sort of work that I've been doing in relation to AI over the last few years, I think in any jurisdiction where the IESBA code applies, compliance with the code is vital. And I think if I was going to pick two of the core elements, I think professional competence and due care comes up again and again and again when you talk about the use of any tools. David touched on some other tools and John touched on some as well. That are not AI, but which are still emerging technologies. And ultimately, professional competence and due care, I think for me, is probably the most important issue, maintaining that understanding. In the context of an AI tool, it might be about understanding what the tool can do. If you're working in an audit firm, what kinds of processes and governance has been applied to the development of a tool. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment with bodies, for example, like the Turing Institute, where they're looking at, well, what does all this mean in the context of AI tools being used by financial professionals? What are we actually expecting people to understand? What does competence mean in the context of AI? Does it mean I could write code myself and I understand exactly what the tool does? Or does it mean I know enough to be able to justify tools use, but I also have to rely to a certain extent on governance and on controls around the tool's development? Confidentiality is another big issue. For example, tools like ChatGPT, it's not abundantly clear if you were to put some information into a tool such as ChatGPT, where it actually goes and what it is actually used for. So I think professional accountants need to be really careful about how they use those tools. Respecting the confidentiality of information is really important. There are some ways around it. If, for example, you were to look to use a large language model and you wanted to really protect your data, local instances of something like ChatGPT where you've got more control over how the data is used are potential solutions, but they come with substantial extra cost over kind of public models. And I think even when professional accountants are doing their work in jurisdictions with a legislation-focused approach, as I said, most of the legislation that we've seen is very focused on higher risk tools. So I think in a lot of scenarios, professional accountants are using tools which are lower down on a risk, probably not subject necessarily to the same stringent rules, which doesn't mean that the principles shouldn't be applied and people shouldn't kind of think very carefully about it. And in the absence of the specific rules, I think that careful exercise of professional judgment is really the key to this. If I'm a professional accountant and I'm thinking about using a machine learning or an AI tool in my work, are there specific elements of legislation I need to think about? If there aren't, are there general principles that I need to consider? even if a jurisdiction hasn't yet set out general principles, a lot of them are quite common sense. You know, if we look at a lot of the things around things like transparency and making sure that a tool is fair, all of those things are hopefully things that, you know, accountants following the IESBA code would sort of keep in the back of their minds whenever they're working anyway. You know, is a tool doing what I'm expecting it to do? Is it giving me sensible results? You go on to the next slide, please. I think the kind of last thing I wanted to pull out before we hopefully have some time for questions is as well as thinking about key messages for professional accountants, is really thinking about key messages for standard setters and regulators. What do we need to do as professionals that spend a lot of time thinking about standards in whatever context that is? What can we do to help mitigate risks and to help ensure that tools are used in a sensible way? I think the recent, IESBA technology-related revisions to the code that David mentioned are effective this year strike a really good balance. I think there are some, things like prohibiting hosting of client data is really vital. And I think strengthening the code in getting people to think about the mindset when making use of technology is really important, because technology changes so rapidly, particularly in the AI space, but thinking about emerging technologies going forwards, it's not always going to be possible for a professional accountant to have a really detailed list of every single thing that is happening at all times, what's changing, what all the new tools are, what all the emerging tools are. So I think the mindset of, professional curiosity, intellectual curiosity, but also keeping in mind fundamental principles around competence and confidentiality is really important. And I think that is going to be an increasingly valuable skill set. Being able to take these kinds of tools at an abstract level sometimes and think about the kinds of sort of judgments that it would be vital to make. I think that principles-based approach to standard setting aligns with the approach taken by a lot of jurisdictions and allows for setting standards that are adaptable, but also giving space for specific prohibitions, specific rules where they are explicitly required. I think if I was to leave one final kind of thought before we kind of hopefully have some questions for a discussion, is thinking about what is the one thing I would want people to carry on sort of doing and really sort of build into what they do. And I think the key to success for standard setters and regulators, to be honest, everyone involved in the space is collaboration, I think, with each other, so that the most consistent approach can be developed. I think with experts in the AI field, I've done some work over the last few years with Rutgers Business School in Newark, with the Turing Institute in the UK, really trying to pull on the fact that a lot of regulators and standard setters might not have AI experts. Ultimately, we're experts in assurance or tax or governance, but that there is a lot of work that can be done together in learning about some of the specific technologies, but in also bringing, I think, the skills that we have when it comes to things like governance and principles-focused approaches in the other direction. And I think a lot of jurisdictions may have their own specific approaches, their own specific ways of dealing with them, but ultimately everyone is trying to deal with the same problems. The challenges that we face when using these tools effectively are global. And I think that collaboration and making sure that everybody is, as much as possible, really trying to work towards the same goal is, to me, vital to ensuring that we can maximize all the benefits and minimize the risks as much as possible. Next slide. Thanks. So that was just a sort of thank everybody and kind of hopefully in the last sort of few moments that we've got open up to see if anyone has any questions or any discussion points. David, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Jason. Very enlightening. Any questions for Jason? We've got a few minutes left, the first hour. Rania?
So thank you, Jason. This was really very insightful. So my question is, you talked about benefits and risks, and you talked about different approaches to legislation. My question to you is there a risk inherent in the fact that there are different approaches to legislation? The inconsistency in the approach to legislation, does it impact the consistency of financial reporting and information and assurance across the globe? So, I mean, regardless of which is the better approach, perhaps everybody should agree to a single approach, even if, I mean, one might have certain advantages or disadvantages over the other.
I think that's an excellent question. And I would love to live in a world where everyone agrees that there's one particular way of doing it. I think what might help that is the United Nations just issued a draft resolution on AI, talking about safe and trustworthy AI, talking about trying to close the divide and making sure that people have access to AI, and talking about governance. So I think what I would hope is that initiatives like that from the UN help to draw people to, even if they don't have exactly the same approach, they have a really solid baseline that is similar enough. I think to a question of whether it's a problem, I think it's it's potentially a huge issue. I've had conversations with people that work at large audit firms where they say, well, if there are 3 different jurisdictions and we're developing an AI tool, we've got to bear that in mind when we think about how we spend money. Because if we develop a really innovative AI tool, but we can only really use it in the more principles-focused jurisdictions, but we, for example, felt we couldn't use it in X jurisdiction because they're much more stringent, then I think in that instance, the firms might make decisions about how they use tools or what kinds of tools they might deploy based in that instance on perhaps the most stringent set of regulations, because if you're applying the most stringent one, you would presumably be able to not fall foul of any more principles oriented things. But I totally agree. I think the inconsistency is potentially an issue, and I kind of live in hope that things like the UN setting out their draft resolutions and things of that nature, which hopefully draw people to an international stage to talk about these kinds of things, will help make sure that there is at least a strong common ground for dealing with these things.
So okay, so from I understand, I mean, your reaction from the perspective of the developers of AI tools, but what about from the perspective of the users of information? So if I'm looking at information or financial reports that have been developed, I mean, in different jurisdictions with different approaches to regulating AI, should that be a concern to me? That's my question, basically. Just
okay. I think that is an incredibly interesting question, because I think it also, speaks to something that some people are worried about, which is, should I be worried about AI tools being used in preparing things? So, if I'm a user of financial information and I can, see that in one jurisdiction, a lot of machine learning tools have been used to help develop disclosures, and perhaps the assurance providers have built that. Does that give me more or less trust in that information than a jurisdiction where perhaps they've taken a more conservative approach? I think for me, it would certainly be something I would be very interested in. Would I be worried? I think is a good question. I think the first question I ask myself is, would I know how much these tools have been used in preparing that financial information? And that's where I think the transparency thing is really important, which is, if there are going to be differences in how people, prepare financial information, as a user, if I'm, considering making financial decisions based on that information across jurisdictions, I think transparency would, in the first instance, be the most helpful thing. So even if there's not a consistent approach, if one jurisdiction is using a lot of machine learning tools and another is not, if that's transparent to me, at least I can factor that into my decision making as a user.
Thank you. Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania. Good question. Thanks, Jason. Maybe we collect a couple of comments, Jason, and come back on those two. We've got 2 others. So we've got Sadia online.
Thank you, David. Jason, I actually have a similar question to Rania, and I was going to frame it a bit differently. You gave us the risk of a PA using AI, but is there a risk that a PA would be looking at data in the future and wondering, is this data secure? Is it does it have integrity? Because of the way that AI is generating information, and it's very hard to tell whether it's something that's generated is pure or factual or real. And then I just want to know whether do you see that as a trend coming forward for all PAs? Every time you consume information, you're going to have to ask whether this can be relied upon before we actually audit it or think about assurance.
Yeah, again, I think that's
And Jason, just shall we collect one more and you can come back on both the questions? So Ken is in the room.
Thanks very much, David. And Jason, thank you for the very informative and insightful presentation about the regulation of AI. I had, in fact, 3 questions, if I may. One is really to understand a bit more the landscape of legislation around the world as it is developing, and whether you're saying legislation that is addressing the deployment of AI in a general sense, for example, general use systems like ChatGPT, or whether using legislation that is targeting specific applications of AI, for example, mission critical applications like you had, for example, use of AI in medical systems, for example, or I can think of also of use of AI in automated driving. Those could be examples. My second question is in relation to the development of ethical standards vis-a-vis legislation. Do you have a sense that there is any global body that is basically in charge or actually developing ethical standards for AI? I know that there are different companies that have developed codes of conduct for the ethical development of their AI systems and so forth. But is there any sort of global trend or organization, for that matter, that is in charge of ethical standards? And my third question is, you mentioned the point about collaboration is a critical issue when it comes to the development of legislation. Have you a sense as to whether legislators around the world, as they've been developing their pieces of legislation, have presumably they have engaged with experts in AI, but have they actually engaged with standard setters in the ethics realm, presumably at the national level, which would be the case because legislation has to be developed at the national level. So any sense as to whether there's any sort of involvement from the profession in the development of regulation of AI?
And Jason, maybe when you're addressing Ken's questions after Sadia's, could you build in a little bit about some of the motives that have sat behind the development of the legislation and the guiding principles? All of it good, presumably.
Sure. So I think to pick on Sadia's question first, should PAs be worried about integrity of data and information? I think the very short answer to that is yes. And I think there's going to be a balancing act. I think many professional accountants' first reaction to it might be to be substantially more distrustful of information that's been prepared with language models or where tools have been deployed, like, for example, to calculate expected credit losses, as we mentioned. Presuming that they've understood the entity that they're looking at, to enough detail, there's always the risk, of course, that you might just not know. For example, if you spend a lot of time looking at large language model outputs, you can pick up subtleties in how it's prepared and presented that gives you hints that somebody probably used a tool to help develop this. Often language models have a style similar to how individuals have writing styles. So I think in the first instance, I would expect a lot of professional accountants to be to be, at least initially, inherently quite skeptical. And I think that that's probably a good thing. I think there will probably need to be a balance at a certain point in the future. And one of the questions that I've kind of grappled with, and to be honest, I'm not sure I have an answer, is at a certain point, if you're, for example, preparing a disclosure, and then you're looking at it as a professional accountant, does it matter if it's been prepared by, an associate in their first year of a training contract, or the first draft has been prepared by a machine learning tool? They're both perhaps not experts, but have some knowledge. So what I think a professional accountant then has to think about is maybe the actual source of it is initially a question, but actually my main concern is about that final output. If it's if it's been developed by a tool and then an individual has carefully reviewed it, is that fundamentally different to having a person do the first draft and then it be reviewed by someone before it's kind of been pushed out? And I think there's still a lot of work to do in that area, but I would expect generally professional accountants to understand if they're looking at an entity where they expect tools to have been used in the preparation of disclosures or any kind of information, to start out a little bit more skeptical. But I think also to need to do the work to understand, what kinds of information they might be presented with that those tools have used. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, there is a lot of concern from an integrity perspective, but I think there are also questions around then how the professional accountant responds to that. That I could probably spend another half an hour going through, but I'll move on to talk about Ken's questions. Landscape around the world in terms of legislation, I think is a really interesting one because it's quite fragmented. So as I mentioned before, for example, in China, legislation is extremely focused on individual cases. This algorithm can be used for X. This algorithm needs to be registered with X or Y body. Whereas the EU approach is a wider, kind of higher level set of legislation, but still identifies specific risk areas. So I think it's quite variable. I'd say that the majority of kind of legislation proposals are certainly at the slightly higher level. So, thinking about risk, categorizing tools in that way, rather than, really detailed legislation that says this tool or that tool should or shouldn't be used in these scenarios. So if I was to kind of make a prediction about where I think legislation as a whole might go, I suspect most jurisdictions will take a legislative approach, which is more like the EU, where it's about legislating for risk. So, it's not saying X or Y tool down at the kind of code level is a problem, but a tool which makes decisions that really impact on individuals, health or financial stuff. So can you have insurance and things is probably the more likely case. So probably still focused on kind of legislating for tools that are kind of bucketed by risk rather than at the algorithmic level. I think ethical standards is an interesting one. I certainly think thinking about ethics from a global perspective, I was kind of quite pleased to see the draft UN resolution, because although it talks about some technical elements, I'd say it's as much about kind of ethical deployment as it is about anything else. It talks about closing the divide so that people can get access to the right tools, so that more developed nations that have spent a lot of time and resource on developing tools can share that knowledge with developing nations. And a lot of the talk, a lot of the content within that resolution is very ethics focused. So I think for me that's promising and hopefully indicative of a kind of international direction, potentially led from an a UN perspective. Collaboration, I think, was the third thing you asked about, which is to what extent have people been collaborating with AI experts and standard setters? from my personal experience, I think it's very jurisdictionally dependent. Certainly when I was in the UK, government was very interested in engaging experts, like, for example, the Turing Institute in the UK, and they were very interested in engaging standard setters and regulators as a whole. There were a number of cross-regulatory working groups and panels and bodies that were really seeking to collate views from experts both in AI, but from experts in ethics, from experts in assurance, to really make sure that when you're developing these ideas, you've taken account of everybody within all the kind of key stakeholders in an ecosystem. I am aware that some other jurisdictions are perhaps a bit less collaborative in that regard. Maybe make use of some AI expertise, but perhaps don't consult standard setters and regulators as much. So I think my kind of personal view on that is that it's quite fragmented and dependent on the jurisdiction, but I also think dependent on whether the jurisdiction's approach is tilting more towards being pro-innovation or more towards kind of mitigating risk. Not that they're mutually exclusive, but most jurisdictions are slightly favoring one over the other. And so I think that there's a variety in the extent to which collaborating, but I would say on the whole, most jurisdictions where I've kind of spoken to individuals in the field or with relevant government bodies are trying to do that collaboration and trying to get to a place where all the right people are being asked the right questions.
Thanks, Jason. There are two more questions in the room. Maybe we can collect those questions, but as brief as possible. I think we're over time. So, Vanya?
Thank you, David. And thank you, Jason, for the presentations. Very interesting to see the pros and cons between principle-based and regulation that you mentioned. There is another point that I think it's relevant in this sense. Whenever you opt to establish regulations, you create the boundaries to avoid penalty, because I can be 99% out of what is common sense. But if I do not give that final step, I can escape the disposition of the law. And that's something very dangerous. That's why I think that principle would be best option in this case. Thank you. Very interesting.
And Amarjit?
Yeah, thanks. Very briefly, I was quite, interested in knowing about the regulatory piece. And there's one slide which you presented. So 3 potential risks, for over-reliance. So my question was, see, we are losing sight of the who's accountable in the system, because when it is applied on the field, it is all a black box to us as far as we are concerned as a regulator. So too much of automation, too much of autopilot, where you have the risk of pilot, as they say, forgetting to fly. Pilot becomes I hate to say that, dumb, because everything is autopilot. So lack of oversight, the risk of lack of oversight over the process, because we don't know what is going on, and the reduction in visibility of who's accountable. Any thoughts on that? I mean, how should regulators deal with this?
I think from my perspective, thinking from a regulatory perspective, I think the first one is to really, and it kind of hits on the point around collaboration, is to really make sure we understand the tools that people are using on a day-to-day basis. Certainly when I was in the UK, at the FRC there, we had a external working group where, in the spirit of everybody understanding what people did, we had a number of audit firms, as well as the FRC and a few other people when they were invited, talking about the kinds of tools that they were using, so that we could understand as a standard setter and a regulator what was actually happening on the ground. I think you're entirely right that regulators and standard setters can't walk blindly into it. And one of the key things I think there is asking the right questions of regulatees, making use of the channels that we have for things like inspections, but also, looking at doing wider thematic work as a regulator. So I think there's a lot of emphasis on the regulators, or there should be, and from a standard setting perspective, on really doing the legwork ourselves as well. If we're asking people from professional competence and due care perspective to really understand the kinds of tools that they're deploying on a day-to-day basis, I think there's a kind of onus on regulators and standard setters to do the same themselves and look for those resources and really try to push our own knowledge. I don't think everyone needs to be an AI expert or able to code. I, for example, am not particularly good at coding, but there's a little bit of kind of, I think, from a regulatory and a standard setting perspective, a need, I think, to push ourselves a little bit to kind of make sure that any contribution we give to it comes from a place of understanding enough. I've also got a lot of detail I could go into on, expectations for professional accountants and what they may or may not need to understand about AI and what is a reasonable ask for a regulator or standard setter, which I could probably do a solid 3 hours on. So, but I'm kind of happy if anyone wants to reach out afterwards to talk about kind of really specific details as well. But hopefully that kind of touches on that question a little bit. That I agree that I think there are issues with how we make sure people use these tools, and I think there's a lot of onus on regulators and standard setters to upskill themselves as well.
Thank you, Jason. And finally, our chair, Gabriella.
Thank you very much, David. I just wanted to make a comment or two before you close the session, but I can't resist even if we are a little bit late. I've been listening with a lot of attention, everything that is happening here, and thank you, Jason, for your presentation. This discussion about principles-based versus regulatory or mandatory approach is extremely interesting. It's as old as the history, but it becomes more clear that there is something that we have to do in this respect, in this area. I was a regulator. I was a regulator, and I'm a lawyer by background. So the two combinations, and being an European regulator, should drive me to think and say that the regulatory approach is always the best. Forget it; it's not my approach, and I will not take. A part of those who say it's regulatory, it's principles based. What I can tell you is that first, regulators are conservative by nature and risk averse. So this idea that they have to regulate to be sure that they control the reality, because they are also a little bit control freaks. So what I don't control is something that frightens me, so I need to control. But they sometimes forget that in trying to control things, there is a lot of things that are left out of their control. I remember 10 years ago, a board member of the Securities Commission where I was working, punching on the table and saying, algorithmic trading, never, I will never allow such a thing. And it was there, everywhere. And then he understood that we had to do something and regulate, but then there was already robo-advice, and he was punching on the table, no, that can't happen, and robo-advice. So regulators are always lagging behind the reality. And on technology, this is more a reality than in any other area. So I think that is something that all of us must assume. And my approach is, why do we have to make a decision between regulatory approach and principles based? Because even in those countries or where this option is made that we need to regulate something, and you demonstrated that there are some clear advantages sometimes to have clear regulation, but we have to assume that there will be always a great part of the reality which will not be captured by that regulation. And this is where ethics starts playing an incredible important role, because if it's not illegal because it's not covered, but probably it's worse than what is illegal. And why couldn't these principles-based approaches, even international, play some space to cover these areas which are not captured by the reality? I don't have a response or a solution, a pragmatic, practical, operational solution for this, but every time I see that there is a complementary road and approach that we should not give up from adopting. Well, that's it. Thank you for this, David.
Thank you, Gabriela. Jason, you want to come back on that, or?
I think just to entirely agree. I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive, and as you know, as I sort of hinted at a little bit, I think principles to help you cover a massive range of scenarios where things might fall between the gaps of legislation makes perfect sense to me. So yeah, I entirely agree with that. Those comments, Gabriel, I think that makes perfect sense to me.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, and I think the work of the IESBA is very important in this space, and I think a lot of the regulatory approaches have been influenced by what IESBA has put out there. It's something we've discussed in the TEG as well. So this is very, very important work in this space. Jason, thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. It sparked a few pretty good questions and thought process, hopefully, in our minds, and hopefully we can keep those processes going in our mind, not just leave it behind at the table. They are important matters and will be addressed going forward. So thank you very much. I appreciate it's late for you, so thank you for joining at this time as well.
No worries. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation and discussion. We are running a bit late again, but can we allow half an hour break to the board? Yeah, shouldn't it be now? No. Okay. So it is, I'm already ahead. So okay, let's start and let's try to. I'm sorry. Let's try to recover some of the delay. So as you change seats, we are now going to discuss the proposal of the working group on CIV's pensions and investment companies. I will recall the board that this is the first staff-driven model working group and work stream. So this is being driven by the staff, the IESBA staff. But of course, this makes even more important the connection and the relationship with the board, because the group, the working group, the staff working group must receive the board's guidance, strategic guidance, comments and contributions every time we meet and even in between. So this is going to be the first, well, we approved, we made a decision to move forward with this work stream last December, but this is the first substantial presentation from this working group, asking for some input from the board. So thank you very much to the working group, Linda, John, Jan and Richard Fleck, I think, but it should be online, for the work undertaken, and the floor is yours, Linda.
Thank you, Gabriela. The project team, which consists of Linda, John, and myself, and Richard Fleck, as Gabriela just mentioned, are very excited to share with the board our preliminary findings and observations as relate to the collective investment vehicles, pension funds, and investment company complexes. It's about a mouthful. If we go to the next slide. During the session today, we will provide you with a short overview of the project and the research methodology we followed, and I will invite John to update the board on some of the preliminary findings and observations based on our research to date. Today, we would like to share with the board our thinking and explore the topic as we explore the topic further. We have not reached any conclusions at this stage and are not making any recommendations. Before inviting the board to comment and raise questions later, John will also provide what the project team sees as being the next steps. If we go to the next slide. Based on the stakeholder feedback on the exposure draft of the proposed definition of listed entity and public interest entities of the code, the IESBA acknowledged that these types of entities and arrangements are diverse in structure, governance, and size. To achieve the objectives of this project as set out in our terms of reference, the project team needs to understand the different regulations that shape the funds in the different jurisdictions. In the first quarter, we researched 3 jurisdictions and will expand the number of jurisdictions in the next quarter. Through our initial research, we have realized although they look very different, there are some preliminary common characteristics, and John will expand a little bit on that later today. The focus of the project is to consider whether independent provisions and the application of the related entity definition remain fit for purpose for CIVs and pension funds when considering the parties such as trustees, managers, and advisors, and to consider whether the board should be enhanced to address the investment company complexes. And John will also talk a little bit about this later. So if we move to the next slide. So while meeting with experts, the project team has been cognizant of addressing whether the definitions in the code and the independence provisions are applied consistently to traditional corporate structures and collective investment vehicles. The objectives of the terms of reference are whether the application of the related entity definition in the International Independence Standards, specifically Part 4A of the code, remains fit for purpose as mentioned. And as part of understanding who are the related entities in these structures, an understanding is necessary of who the client is and whether the code applies equivalent or in a consistent way to CIVs as to those of traditional corporate structures. Only then we can determine if the relevant entities are captured in respect of CIVs and when applying this related entity definition. If we move on to the next slide, talking about the research methodology that we followed, is the project team dedicated most of activities and on 3 jurisdictions as mentioned, which included Australia, South Africa, and the United States. And we also gained insight into the context of the complexities surrounding the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations regarding investment company complexes. We followed a mixed methodology approach, which included a desktop research on existing standards, legislation and regulation to better understand CIVs and the relationships with their third parties. And we also met with industry experts and auditors, and national standard setters and regulators to gather further insights into current practices and challenges. Table 1 of Annexure 1 of our paper sets out the stakeholders the project team met since December last year. And we'd really like to thank the stakeholders that we engaged with that took the time to help us better understand these structures. We do acknowledge that this is a small number of jurisdictions and only a small number of that we've reached out so far, and we will expand that over the next quarter with a list of potential stakeholders we wish to engage with in Table 2. This is not an exhaustive list and it will keep on growing as we continue with the project. Our feedback today is focused on CIVs and investment company complexes. We have commenced exploring on pension funds. However, this work will increase in quarter 2 of 2024 and with the results to be shared during the June meeting. I'll hand over to John. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. So this part of the presentation really has 2 elements. So firstly, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the traditional corporate structures and the code's definitions around related entity, audit client, and then the application of some of the provisions, independent provisions on management responsibility and non-assurance services. And then with that backdrop, we'll then discuss collective investment vehicles and investment company complexes, and then the project team's initial observations on the principles in the code and some of the areas that we require further exploration in respect to these arrangements. So we could just go to the next slide, please. So as mentioned, the objectives in the terms of reference for the project team include looking at collective investment vehicles and their relationships with trustees, managers and advisors on whether the related entity provisions and Part 4A of the code are fit for purpose for these arrangements. So when determining the scope of the independence provisions in Part 4A, the starting point is the definition of audit client. So an audit client is the entity in respect of which a firm conducts an audit engagement. And then within Part 4A, paragraph 400.27 then sets out what an audit client consists of for the purposes of Part 4A. And this depends on whether or not the client is a publicly traded entity or not. So if the client is not a publicly traded entity, the audit client includes related entities over which the client has direct or indirect control. So that means it's subsidiaries, and that's represented by the blue circles in the diagram there. Then the orange circle in the diagram also applies in certain circumstances to a client that is not a publicly traded entity. So in this circumstance, so it's if the audit team knows or has reason to believe that a relationship or circumstance involving any other related entity of the client is relevant to evaluating the firm's independence, then that entity must be included when identifying, evaluating, and addressing threats to independence. I did just want to point out we have made an adjustment to this diagram from what was put into what was included in the agenda paper, just to make it clear that the reason to believe test that I've just mentioned does not create another level of related parties, and that it applies to the clients that are not publicly traded entities. So then if a client is a publicly traded entity as defined within the code, audit client includes all of its related entities, as represented by the green circle in the diagram. So that means you need to look upstream, so that's the client's parent, as well as entities with significant influence over the client where that interest is material. You also need to look downstream, so that's the client's subsidiaries and also entities that the client or its subsidiaries have significant influence over, and that is also in material. And you also need to look sideways, so that's the client's sister entities, and that's where there is common control, and both the client and the sister are both material to the entity that controls them. If we could just go to the next slide, please. So this is just representing that in another way for that traditional corporate structure where the audit client and its related entities, as per the code, are pretty well understood. So in the example here, the client is not a publicly traded entity. So the audit client, as represented by the red dotted line, consists of the client and the entities which the client has direct or indirect control. So we'll just go to the next slide, please. So when we've been assessing collective investment vehicles and their relationships with trustees, managers and advisors, the project team has considered the code's independence provisions, but with an initial focus on management responsibility and certain non-assurance services provisions, so as to determine whether they apply consistently, as John mentioned, to collective investment of vehicles compared to how it does for traditional corporate structures. So just to provide this, the backdrop as well. So firstly, in respect of management responsibility, firms must not assume management responsibility for an audit client. Management responsibility involves controlling, leading and directing an entity. And then on the slide there are some examples of management responsibility, including authorising transactions, controlling or managing bank accounts or investments, or taking responsibility for the preparation of the client's financial statements. So in respect of non-assurance services or NAS, before providing a NAS to an audit client, amongst other things, the firm must apply the conceptual framework to identify, evaluate and address any threat to independence. And firms must also determine whether the NAS might create a self-review threat by evaluating whether there is a risk that the NAS will form part of the accounting records or internal controls or financial reports on which the audit opinion is being provided. And the audit team will rely on judgments or activities from the NAS when conducting the audit. So we could just go to the next slide, please. So this is just setting out that same diagram we just looked at for the traditional corporate structure, but just to highlight that the management responsibilities sit within the parameters of the audit client, which is again represented by the red dotted line. So as mentioned, the firm can't or cannot assume any of those management responsibilities for an audit client. Also, any threats, including self-review threat resulting from non-assurance services, relate to such services that are provided within the parameters of the audit client. Okay, so just next slide, thanks. So that's just to provide, obviously, a brief overview of the traditional corporate structure. Yeah, next slide, Mary. Thank you. And now we're going to explore collective investment vehicles and investment company complexes and the project team's preliminary observations on those concepts and principles that we've just talked about regarding audit client, related entity management responsibility and NAS that are set out in the code. And then just to highlight some of the questions this has raised for us and which we want to explore further as we move forward with the project. Next slide, please. So Appendix 2 of the agenda paper provides a high-level overview of certain regulated collective investment vehicles, as Jean mentioned, in Australia, South Africa, and the United States. We have started looking at other jurisdictions and also other types of CIVs, such as private equity funds and certain hedge funds, but these will be the focus of our further research as we go forward and when we provide further input to the board. So this diagram here depicts a fairly simplified structure for these regulated CIVs. Some of the CIV structures that we have seen so far are actually really complex. However, for the purposes of today's discussion, we just wanted to focus on some of the fundamental aspects of these. So the project team has noted similarities in the jurisdictional structures, but also some really important differences in relation to governance and oversight functions. So for example, the CIV oversight body can be within the CIV itself, which is the case in corporate models such as in the United States, where the CIV is a company or a trust and it has its own board or trustees. However, the CIV oversight body can also sit outside of the CIV. And this is the case in Australia where there is what's called a responsible entity. And this is a separate company to the collective investment vehicle. And it acts as both the trustee and also the manager of the fund. So the Australian model is more of a contractual based model where there is a portfolio and it doesn't necessarily have its own legal existence or stuff, or it might actually be created as a trust through a trust deed. So there's some quite significant differences that we've noted there between those two. In relation to the investments and the day-to-day operations of the collective investment vehicle, these are managed by either a management company or an investment advisor. There might also be other third parties that provide services to the CIV, such as custodians, distributors, transfer agents, and various others. The CIVs generally invest in a range of investments as part of a portfolio, but the CIV would not necessarily control those investments, and therefore they wouldn't be related entities of the CIV under the code. Her research has shown, and also when we've talked to stakeholders, they invariably refer to CIVs being in a very heavily regulated industry. So there are various independent oversight requirements and investor protection mechanisms. So for example, there are often requirements for independent directors. Sometimes there's requirements for compliance committees. Obviously there's requirements around audits, as well as regulatory oversight and monitoring. And also often the investment advisor must also be registered separately or licensed with a regulator. The other third parties that I've mentioned, they might also have various different regulatory requirements as well. And the other important aspect we've noted is that legislation and regulations sometimes also include requirements on auditor independence. And that's something that I'm going to go through towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So just to summarise, some of the common characteristics of CIVs that we've researched to date include that they can be corporate structures, like I said, in the US, or maybe more contractual based, like in Australia. The CIVs are typically regulated. They're generally open to the public, which enables the pooling of that money and those assets and for shared profits and income. The investments and day-to-day operations are managed by a third-party advisor or manager. So what that means is that typically the CIV does not have any employees itself within the fund. So what we've found is that potentially the roles or functions undertaken by the investment advisor or manager might be considered management responsibilities. So the project team are considering whether this creates any inconsistencies with the application of the code's independence requirements compared to traditional corporate structures that we talked about before. So further, like the investment advisor or the manager might not be captured within the code's definitions of audit client or related entity, and that might impact the identification of threats to auditor independence. So just to explore that a little bit further, so the audit client would likely to be the CIV itself, as this is the entity in respect of which the firm conducts the audit engagement, and so not necessarily the investment advisor or manager. Also, the investment advisor or manager also might not be a related party, because if the client is not a publicly traded entity, the audit client is the client and the entity is that it controls, and that would not likely include the advisor or the manager. And even if the CIB is a publicly traded entity, which means, as we looked at before, that all related entities are included within the audit client, the advisor or manager might not control or have significant influence over the CIV in that traditional ownership sense, and as per the related entity provisions in the code. Next slide, please. Just due to the differences that we've just talked about and identified with the collective investment vehicles, the project team has delved deeper into the audit client definition and also around management responsibilities. So as an audit is a subset of an assurance engagement, we considered the conceptual applicability of the definition of assurance client in the code. So an assurance client is the responsible party, and also in an attestation engagement, the party taking responsibility for the subject matter information. And this might be the same person as the responsible party. This definition of assurance client is also linked to the international framework for assurance engagements, which details the parties to an assurance engagement, which is set out in the diagram on the slide there. First of all, there's the responsible party who is responsible for the underlying subject matter, which would be, for example, the entity's financial position, financial performance, and also their cash flows. Then the measurer or evaluator is responsible for the subject matter information, such as the financial statements, by applying a criteria like IFRS to the underlying subject matter. And then we have the engaging party that enters into the terms of engagement with the practitioner. So the measurer or evaluator and the engaging party might be the same as a responsible party, but that's not always the case. It can be separate entities. Part 4B of the code requires a firm to be independent of an assurance client, but it also contemplates circumstances where a third party might compile or take responsibility for the subject matter information, in which case the assurance client includes the client, but also that third party. So due to the differences between how CIVs are structured compared to traditional corporate structures, we as the project team have been cognizant of whether any third parties to the CIVs, such as the trustees, the managers, or the advisors, are responsible for the underlying subject matter, maybe the subject matter information, or potentially if they're engaging parties. So just by way of example, in Australia, when you're looking at like example financial statements of a collective investment vehicle in Australia, the independent auditor's report is actually made out to the directors of the responsible entity, which I mentioned before is that separate entity. And also the director's declaration is made out by the directors of that responsible entity. So in that sense, that potentially that responsible entity is the engaging party. So the terms of reference, doesn't contemplate the revision of the definition of audit client, but the project team will continue to explore the relevance of these underlying principles that we've just talked about around assurance client and also this third party arrangement, and in the assurance framework as we develop recommendations for the board. Next slide, please. As previously noted, obviously one of the fundamental premises of the code's independence provisions is that the firm must not assume a management responsibility for an audit client. And the slide is just setting out the same information there around management responsibilities and what it involves and examples of that. We've also considered the relevance of the IESBA material in ISO 200, which sets out the auditor's responsibilities and overall objectives of the independent auditor. ISO 200 also notes that the financial statements that are subject to audit are those of the entity prepared by management and with the oversight of those charged with governance. ISO 200 also defines management as the person or persons with executive responsibility for the conduct of the entity's operation. And as we've just talked about, the international framework for assurance engagement also includes roles that are commensurate with management and also with those charged with governance around the responsible party being responsible for the subject matter information as well. And what we've seen is that some of these management roles or functions might be performed by the third-party trustees, managers, or advisors. So next slide, thanks. So I guess the question is what is the potential concern as a result of this? So our preliminary observations are that CIVs might not be addressed by the code in the same way as traditional corporate structures. So if a firm provides certain functions or services to a third party, such as an investment advisor or manager of the CIV, and depending on that third party's role or responsibility and the nature of the services provided, the question that we're sort of thinking about and grappling with is whether this would result in an assumption of management responsibility or potentially a self-review threat. And as noted before, the investment advisor or manager might not meet the definition of an audit client or related entity, which then might impact the identification of threats to auditor independence. So some examples that come to mind which could be provided by a firm include designing, implementing, monitoring or maintaining internal controls for an investment manager and then auditing the CIV. A firm potentially could store or manage data of an investment manager or advisor that ultimately relates to the CIV's transactions and operations. Or another example could be that NAS could be provided to an investment advisor or manager that might create a self-review threat for the CIV audit client, such as providing accounting and bookkeeping services. However, just to note, the project team needs to further explore these relationships between the CIV and the manager advisor and to gain a broader understanding of the services that firms are currently providing to these third parties and as part of our ongoing research and stakeholder engagement. Next slide, thanks. As I mentioned before, some jurisdictions we've looked at have actually directly dealt with auditor independence in relation to collective investment vehicles. And we've highlighted some difference in terms of how those have been approached and how they've addressed the unique nature of the CIV and also the auditor independence. So in the United States, for registered investment companies, the Securities and Exchange Commission has developed specific rules for investment company complexes, and I'll go into a bit more detail on those in the following slide. Also in the United States, the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct, which is more relevant to unregistered CIVs, they've got an expanded definition of affiliate, which is essentially an equivalent term to related party in the IESBA Code. And the expanded definition of affiliate includes there are specific entities that are related to pension funds, which are considered affiliates, and we will explore those further as we go forward. But in respect to CIVs, affiliates includes an investment advisor, a general partner, or a trustee of a fund if the fund is material to the investment advisor, general partner, or trustee, and it's deemed to have either control or significant influence over the fund. So it actually deems that there is that control element or the significant influence. And the materiality is based on a consideration of investments in the fund, but also fees that are received from the fund. However, in Australia, they've actually taken a different approach where the corporations legislation has specific provisions on auditor independence. And then when you're applying some of those provisions, the legislation requires the audit firm to include as part of the audited body, or in other words, the audit client, the responsible entity and the directors of that responsible entity. So as mentioned before, the responsible entity is both the trustee and manager and a separate legal entity to the collective investment vehicle. So as we go forward, the project team just want to delve a little bit further into the AICPA and also the Australian approaches during the next quarter. But I also just want to note within Australia, they've actually recently enacted a separate type of CIV, which is more of a corporate-based model. And we want to have a look at that as well. But it's only been introduced recently. So as far as we're aware, there hasn't been a large amount of uptake in those types of entities. Next slide as well, please. So yeah, just moving on to preliminary observations on investment company complexes. So with these, there's certain CIVs are defined as investment companies in the Investment Company Act of 1940, and these can actually either be a company or a trust. These companies can be classified as mutual funds, closed-end funds, unit investment trusts, or exchange-traded funds. The investment company must register with and is regulated by the SEC where there is a certain number of investors, where there's more than 100 investors, I believe it is. And is detailed in the agenda paper and also in the IESBA's benchmarking report, which compared the SEC and PCAOB rules to the code. The SEC rules include investment company complex as an additional part of the affiliate definition. And again, the affiliate definition is kind of an equivalent term to related entity in the code. So then the SEC rules specifically define what is an investment company complex and sets out the entities within an investment company complex that are considered to be affiliates of the audit client. And effectively, the rules require the auditor to always be independent of the investment advisor. The rules on the ICCs are quite complex from what we've gathered so far, and also some of the stakeholders we've spoken to so far have indicated, around the practical implication of the rules is quite an involved process. But as noted up there, the code that does not currently have specific provisions around investment company complexes. Next slide, thanks. So that is, just an overview of what we've undertaken to date and some of the observations that we've found so far. And we also will continue to explore how the different jurisdictions, as we move through the jurisdictions, about how they've approached auditor independence in respect of CIVs and their relationships with the trustees and managers as we develop our report and recommendations for the board. We've obviously got quite a lot of work to do over the coming months to expand our research into other jurisdictions and also in relation to pension funds. And we have a whole raft of other stakeholders that we want to speak to as well. So in terms of our next steps, we will extend the desktop research into pension funds, other jurisdictions, and to continue to explore the concepts, principles, and some of those questions that I've alluded to throughout the presentation. We'll continue to engage with relevant stakeholders. We've got a table 2 in the appendix 1 of the agenda paper, which sets out some of the stakeholders that we want to speak to. We intend to hold some workshops with relevant stakeholders to explore regulation on auditor independence and potential gaps in the code and in local regulations. We will discuss this work at the IESBA National Standards Setters meeting in New York in May and seek their input and feedback from the NSS members. And the intention is to provide a further update at the June 24 meeting to the board, and then the recommendations will be presented in the second half of this year. So next slide. And we're just wanting to get the feedback from the board, any comments from the board and observations. So Gabrielle, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you very much, John and Linda, for the presentation and for the impressive work already done in making the research about the different structures in the different jurisdictions. I hope that the board has comments and suggestions to what you have presented. I will recall that this is just an update, so we are not asking for any approval or nothing. It's just to help the working group to proceed with the work in the right direction. And I see some board members wanting to speak. Laurie, you first.
Yeah, and these may not be things you know the answer to, so they may be takeaways for as you think about this. I'm not sure where you are, but given that CIVs often have no employees, are using third-party service providers, how are you thinking about control and the related entity definition for the outsourcing activities where the control might actually be split between parties? And I think that just gets a little bit tricky, because I did note you mentioned some of the definitions of the SEC, if it's material or significant, that clearly seems like could be split up. And then the second question is on the ICC. Obviously, the ICC, the definition of materiality is a regulated definition, right? So it's not an accounting test or definition the way we normally see it. And I think I know the answer. I think you're looking at other jurisdictions to see what they're doing, and because those are two very different things, obviously, an accounting or a code type definition and a sort of a regulated, it's automatic, right?
So yeah, obviously we're not at a point of making any recommendations or anything, but what we have found is, so with discussions with in relation to the ICC rules, you're exactly right that what the stakeholders have told us is that basically the accounting principles do not work in this sense in terms of the control mechanism, and it basically is a deemed control, and as you said, it's a regulated control. So it's basically a deemed control to ensure that there is just a consistent application across the board. And then in terms of, we've had initial discussions in relation to EU provisions, and what they've said there is that the way the legislation or the provisions are set out is that the various roles that are allocated to the different third parties is separated in such a way that there is no control with any one party, if that makes sense. Yeah. So again, this just highlights various differences across the jurisdictions, and that a number of considerations.
That's going to be the trick.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
That's okay.
Thank you, Laurie and John. David.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for walking through. That was really helpful. I did have a couple of questions. One of them is, I was reflecting as you were talking about structures and you were talking about concepts of control, and I think Laurie touched on this a little bit as well. I think I see a lot of similarity sometimes to what companies go through with holding companies and other unusual structures, even in corporate world. So part of me was wondering, how much of this is already addressed in the code, but we don't necessarily see a recognition or an application of it in this particular space. That was one question I had. And the second question I had was around your desktop research, was just, did you get any kind of insight around let's call it an industry, like this particular industry, recognizing that the code could be quite helpful for them, but also around that, then definitions around some of these vehicles can change over time. So again, just thinking through, is there an industry tendency to wait for a particular vehicle to be defined, or again, is there recognition of the principle and how that might apply? Thank you.
Again, probably just a preliminary observation, but the fact is, I guess from the ones that we have looked at, is that from those jurisdictions, there has been a desire to address it in another way from what the code is doing it. And that's like, for example, we just talked about the US have deemed a control in that situation, whereas in Australia, as a separate example, they have, rather than deeming the control, they're requiring the audit firm to bring the responsible entity, which is that advisor, essentially within the fold of the actual audit client definition, I guess. So different ways of addressing that. Did you have any other comments on that sort of thing? But yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, David and John. Mark, please.
So thank you firstly for coming a long way in a very short time. So it was good to hear your thinking. One question I had, or one issue for consideration, and it's based on my own experience of looking at independence implications for lending syndicates, and that is, what's in the investment vehicle can change very quickly, and can have significant implications for your assessment of any threats to independence. And therefore, in a sense, you need almost to be able to work out what the thresholds are that change the situation from not posing a threat to your independence to posing a threat to your independence? And are you able to track that information in sufficiently real time? So I would encourage the group in looking at this to perhaps devote a little time to thinking about how do you actually determine the threat posed by what's in the vehicle, noting that it's not going to be static. But I think, you know, some great insights, and all power to you in carrying on with this.
We'll probably just take that on board, Mark, to look into it as we go forward. But thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I think this is a relevant point. Thank you for raising it. And Luigi.
And thank you for the working group for proposing these analyses that I think it is very key in order to go on with what it was not addressed during the PI project. And I have some considerations because I think that the research phase is just at the very beginning stage, the preliminary stage, frankly, because the diversity in this space is very, very huge. If I consider Europe, for example, and I would recommend to consider in particular way Europe, from country to country, we have a very high diversity. I would suggest to specifically consider at least Luxembourg, Ireland, and some other countries, because they have, they could be very good representative and sample to be examined. And even within a country, there is a very high diversity. Speaking of my country, the similar object is regulated in a different way depending on many circumstances. And if you are searching for a structure or a model to be applied in all circumstances, unfortunately, you will end in the same place where the PI project ended. So in a very difficult situation. So probably you need to be prepared to deal with a very huge diversity of model, framework, regulations. There are regulating in a different way, something that could be similar depending on various circumstances. And you need to be prepared to consider that and also potential different scenario. When we go to the concept of assurance and trying to infer something from the assurance, you need also to stay very aware that even though audit is a sort of is a part of the assurance, it is not the same. And when you go to the assurance, you will enter into a space where independence is subject matter driven. And I don't think this should be, or let's say, this is my opinion, I don't think this should be the final state of the story, because it would not be, I think, in the public interest. So you may take something from the assurance, but I don't think that the end state would be to apply, let's say, the relating consequences. Another matter that I think you should take into consideration is that governance concept is probably the most relevant one in order to try to understand these type of models or structures or frameworks. Because at the end, you will probably be in a situation where in most of the cases, you will not have the concept of control, and you cannot speak about related entity. You may probably speak about connected entities, and probably the connection is based on the governance. When you go to independence risk, I don't think that independence risk per se is sufficient, but when you go to the independence risks, I think that one of the most important matter to consider is the concept of beneficiaries. Who is the beneficiary of service or relationship? Because if you do not have this connection, you may lose the the connection with the real risk. But most of all, probably, I would recommend not to start from NAS on management responsibilities, because we can have the risk to lose everything else, even ethics. So I would have, let's say, a more holistic view on this point. First, understand the various, let's say, the diversified situation we can have, the diversified framework, where the governance is, who is the beneficiaries, and then to try to apply the code, including the independence provision.
Thank you, Luigi. Paul, please.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, John.
Yeah, thank you, Luigi. Very good points. And like we've already have noted that already in relation to EU from initial discussions, including people that were from Luxembourg and Ireland, as you mentioned. So even with that, so just when we were talking earlier about the corporate structures compared to contractual structures, they noticed very big differences in terms of the responsibility for those things that you've talked about as well. The concept of assurance, we have just looked at that. We're just trying to look at the underlying principles with that and whether there are some application from that we can use within our recommendations, but not necessarily saying that's the way to go. We're looking at some of those principles. But yeah, in terms of your point around the beneficiaries, we'll look into that a bit further as well. So thank you. Yep.
Thank you very much, John. Paul, please.
Thank you. Just looking at the the potential stakeholders you're looking at to engage around this conversation, really just seeing how we can unpack a true cross-section of jurisdiction sizes where you have very different levels of concentration and impact when you look at the CIV space. So as we make any recommendations, we're sure that it's truly applicable across the spectrum of where the code may come to apply, but just a comment more than a question. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Any reaction? Thank you very much. Rich, please.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I appreciate all the effort that's put in. I've seen some of it behind the scenes. I know you've done a lot, and this is not an easy area, and I know we're in fact finding. I support a lot of what Luigi said. I think in some of the countries you're going to yet to get to, or if you're at least beyond the three you listed, you're going to find that all these services are wrapped up in what, for lack of a better word, is a management company. And so that makes that analysis a little different. I also don't think we should be thinking that the assurance model is the right way to approach this. But I have a reason for that, and that is, or maybe a way that helps think through this, and these are just suggestions. But you made a statement that says the fund doesn't control the advisor. I would encourage you to look at it the other way around and look at the advisor's ability to control the fund, its rights and its responsibilities. That is, in fact, I think, while it's been stated that some of these frameworks are regulatory, I think they're actually based more on the concept that control exists via the contractual rights and privileges and benefits, and that's why they should be considered a related entity. It's very similar to why we say in the code, indirect or direct control upward, the parent is a related entity. And as you look at that, there is a challenge. I think, John, you may have been alluding to this, that in certain accounting frameworks, contractual control is well defined and explained, and it's less clear in others. Okay, but I think if you focus on what do they do and what can they do, but important element of that is, can they be replaced? Because if they can be replaced by a board of trustees, then they're more of a service provider and a vendor. I'd also be careful about, and I'm a little confused, and when you said you changed that chart, I think the new chart helps, but I'm a little confused, be honest, on 12 through 16. But as you look at parties who do something for these funds, they may not be related entities. They may be nothing more than service providers and vendors. The auditors may be getting service control organization reports from them, but there isn't really, at least as we've dealt with it in other scenarios with service control or service organizations, that wouldn't necessarily dictate auditor independence. And then I think when you look at, I was a little confused by this whole look at 4B and that, but again, I think you get away from having to evaluate individual management responsibility considerations, that if you get to a view that says, hey, they really do control and thus should be considered part of the related entity, just like a parent would be, then you just treat them like we treat any other parent controlling entity in that evaluation. So I'll pause there. The others may have. I have one other thing that's not related to that aspect. But as we think of who we're going to think about in these CIVs, I do think we need to think about, there are CIVs that require either by their own determination or by regulation that investors are limited to extremely qualified high individuals with or companies with high assets values and certain levels of experience and income flows. They also often don't allow anybody to buy or sell once the fund is formed. You're in it for your term. I have a hard time. I think we should challenge or consider whether those are even in the scope of this, because those don't seem to be public interest entities. They're very private in who's involved and what goes on from there. So that's not related to the bulk of this discussion, but just an observation. Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments, but yeah, thank you for your comments, Rich. Couple of things I wanted to say. With your point about the advisors controlling the fund, the issue we've sort of found with that is that if you're auditing the fund and say it's not a publicly traded entity, you're not going to look up to the advisor. So even if the advisor controls it through contractual mechanism, etc., the way the code works at the moment is you're not going to look up because it's down. Sorry, the fund is below the advisor, which is why I think the SEC rules has deemed that control to be, and it's incorporated within the affiliate definition, the upward mechanism. But that's just on that point. But we can certainly look into that and be interested on your point on that, your view on that point.
Yeah, I actually am not sure if I agree, because the reason we look up is they control. And again, I think you have to think about, just if we don't think the code covers that today, because you're saying they're private, so we don't consider the parent, maybe that's what we change in the code. All right, that we consider that, because I think it's a problem personally that you have people who effectively control the fund and you don't have to be objective and impartial relative to them. Okay.
And those are probably the details which are not details that we are looking for and the group is looking for. And I think that the question at the start of the presentation points in that direction, but we'll go there. Tomoyo, please, with all your experience in asset management.
Thank you, Gabriela. Yes, thank you for the presentation. It was very helpful. So one thing I first think is that these vehicles are normally planned to for investment purpose. So for that, as that is the purpose, it normally has a strongly monitored by the investors. And these companies, whether it's third party or directly managed, have many fiduciary duties. So I think it's good to review whether what is covered by those fiduciary duties and what is not. And especially for the auditor, the very challenging part is that, as Mark mentioned, these companies consist of many stocks, equities, and products. So it's quite complicated. and like measuring the fair value or such kind of things are more challenging from the auditor. From a management structure purpose, it's quite straightforward. And as mentioned, maybe whether it's third party or directly, I think that it's quite in place. So I think it's better to more review from an auditor lens, and what is the challenging part for the auditor, and again, whether auditor needs to look into the management structure in detail, maybe not, and maybe there's other areas that is making auditor a bit challenging. In independence, I think, as mentioned, as a part of the fiduciary duty, I think the investment companies are aware of the independence between the company and the auditor. But maybe that might not have been the priority to, but so as to review. But again, as a part of the fiduciary duty, I think the investment company have a responsibility to say that the auditor is independent from the company. And I think we shouldn't too much chase about what is the independence between the auditor and the products that consist of the portfolio. Then it will be an endless discussion and become out of focus. And so again, that's my observation and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tomoyo. John, do you want to collect a few more questions, or do you want to react immediately?
I might just quickly react.
Okay.
But yes, thank you for your comments. Pretty much every time we've spoken to stakeholders, they've made that sort of comment around how heavily regulated the industry is in terms of those consumer protection mechanisms. But I guess, yeah, and it probably goes back to what we were just talking to Rich about, it's around who or which bodies or entities that the auditor is required to be independent of, and whether it is capturing the right entities and whether it is controlled through contractual mechanisms or whatever it is, whether they are being independent or being required to be independent of those management companies or advisors, and whether that is an issue or a concern. But yeah, thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Tomoyo and John. Amarjit, please.
So I don't have any question actually, but just to compliment the IESBA team, I think it's a very useful piece of work, and to my mind, it has the potential to contribute to the integrity of securities markets and also useful for securities market regulators. Second, just an offer, if you want to cover the Indian mutual fund industry, it's growing very fast. We have 45 mutual funds today and 50 million individual investors, growing at a speed of 20% per annum. So I'm happy to facilitate the relevant details if you want to include that study. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Amarjit. This is actually relevant. Rania, please. I think it's the last question.
Thank you. So I just have two questions and a comment. My first question is, so you referred to some potential concerns regarding, the CIV manager or advisor, investment advisor. What about the other roles that you picked up with respect to the collective investment vehicle, such as the CIV administrator, the distributor, the promoter, sponsor? Are there?
Sorry, Rania, do you mind speaking to the mic, because people online may not.
My question is, could there be also some potential concerns there? So that's my first question. And then my second question is the scope of your work, which I really think was excellent work, very interesting and very insightful. Thank you. But does it include or exclude publicly owned investment vehicles? Does it include public pension funds? Does it include sovereign wealth funds, for example? Because I think if that is the case, then you should, I suggest that you make sure that you, give them very special attention, because I believe that will be, they will be a completely different or substantially different case, especially that, I mean, especially because you're talking about a related entity that will be the government. And we noticed yesterday from all the discussions and the presentations, one of the ethical, I mean, everything seems to tie up together. One of the major issues is that when audit firms provide, grow very large and they provide a lot of services to the government, is that, does that create an issue? And then finally, my last observation is when I look at the appendix, the stakeholders and the regional coverage, which is very nice because you're trying to cover everything. But just a tiny observation regarding IESBA. So I know it's considered Middle East and Africa, but I would recommend that you go to the Arab region because I mean, I don't know much about the African region, but I would say the Arab region would be quite different. So recommendation to make sure that you cover the Arab region very specifically. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rania. Just on your first question around the other roles, again, preliminary, but probably goes back to Rich's point as well around that control element through contractual means, etc. At this point, we haven't noticed huge issues with those, but we'll continue looking in terms of whether they are having a significant impact on the application of the CIVs. With the pension funds and we haven't really delved into pension funds deeply at this point, but we'll take your comment on board on that, and as well as your one on the regions. So thank you.
Well, I don't see anyone else, and we had a lot of comments. I'm very grateful for this active contribution from the board to a work stream which is not easy and which is not just more of the same, as we could see from the comments here around the table. If I may try to help a little bit the working group wrap up some of the comments or some of the suggestions, I think we should pay attention, I think, to what was David's suggestion to clarify a little bit what's already in the code that addresses this situation, because I think it was your difficulty that it was not absolutely clear what's in the code that already addresses this and might need to be changed or not. So this is one of the comments. There were some comments with respect to the need to enlarge the work with respect to other structures and other regions, namely from Luigi, with respect to Europe, which I think is important, not only because it amounts for a considerable part of the global asset management, global values, but because I have some significantly stabilized structures and governance models, which can be relevant for this purpose. But also from Rania with respect to the Middle East. Then I'd like to highlight what Amajit said, and he was not probably the only one, but this idea that this is about after all, this is about investor protection. This is really about protecting investors. Collective investment vehicles, they live upon information. This is what makes them alive. It's transparency. It's about what makes investors make decisions. So if anything, the importance of having credible and reliable information here is extremely relevant, but I'd also raise the attention of the group to Tomoyo's comment on the specificities of collective investment fund vehicles when compared with the traditional structures, because this thing of the fiduciary duty may work as an element of stabilization and an element that may, in some cases, make it less necessary to be so intrusive in terms of ensuring that everything is clear in terms of independence and etc. And this is something that it's, I think, irrespective of the structure, the fiduciary duty is always there, in the sense that the manager, whatever the structure is always bound to respect and follow and serve the interests of the investors and not any other interest. So I think this was a very rich discussion. Then we have the questions around the concepts and what means assurance in this respect. We can't lose sight of the purpose. So I wish the group good work and fruitful work for the next phase. And thank you very much, first, for having advanced so much work in such a short timeline. And secondly, for what's still to come and the significant work that is ahead to make sure that by June we have more or less an idea of what may be necessary to do. And with this, if no one else wants to speak, I would close this first part of this morning session here, but I will ask for your understanding and ask you to come back in 15 minutes time because we are running late and this risks to be running late more and more. So we would come back at 11:45. Okay, 18 minutes, 11:40, 45, is it okay? No, 35?
11:37.
Okay, 11:40, Ken, okay, 11:40.
Okay. Then it's
11:40, we will be back. Thank you very much. Okay, sorry, we are still missing a few board members and staff, but let's restart. So thank you very much for coming back, and I apologize again for the short break, but yeah, I think we are rewarded by the quality of the discussion before this break. Welcome, Robert Buchanan again. And welcome Jens Paul. I see Jens Paul on the screen. Very welcome. For the new board members and those who don't know him, Jens Paul was a board member for 6 years, left us in December, but not completely, because he's still following the tax project and rollout, and helping with the sustainability workstream work. And I also see Sanjeev. Sanjeev, hello, good to see you again. Sanjeev was also a board member until December. There you are, all very welcome, part of the family. It's very good to see you here again. So for the rest of the morning, we have a short update on the rollout plan for the tax planning standards. And after that, we will have a presentation by the Brunswick Group, Alexandra Abreu Loureiro and Matthew Brown, who are kindly accepted to be here with us. They traveled from London and Lisbon to be here to meet the board and present on the work that they have been doing with the IESBA to help us develop our communications capacity. And without further ado, we are going to try to recover some of the delay, and I'm going to give the floor to Carla, is that you? Who will speak about tax planning rollout plan.
Thank you, Gabriella. Welcome everyone, and welcome to Jens and Sanjeev. Very pleased to see you all here. They are the members of the task force that we had previously, and they volunteered to be the task force for the rollout as well. So I'm very pleased we retained the same members. The others were Laurie, Chana, and Andy, and Jens as well. And for the rollout, we are also supported by Dave and team from Comms, and later on, you will have the opportunity to hear from Brunswick in terms of how they can help us create a splash in terms of launching the tax planning final pronouncement. Next slide, please. I was told to keep the session short, so I'll take the slide as read. So subsequent to the approval of the standard, the tax planning final pronouncements will be going to the PLB for certification. The meeting is due to be April 8th to 10th. The initial plan will be to have the launch of April 15th, subject to PLB certification. As you're aware, in some jurisdiction, April 15th is also known as a tax day. So we thought it'd be appropriate to launch tax planning final pronouncement on the same day. The usual strategy that we have for the launch will be the release of a press release, infographic and fact sheet, the final pronouncement and basis of conclusion document. At the same time, we plan to have a series of video featuring our task force members answering 5 questions, and Dave has kindly offered to organize this week. The questions the task force member will be looking at to record and be able to release to the market will be, what does ethical tax planning mean to you? Can you describe the essence of the tax planning final pronouncement, and what do these final standards plan to achieve? What aspects of the standard had generated the most discussion during board meetings? And could these standards have prevented some of the scandals that you see in the news, such as the LuxLeaks and Panama Paradise Papers? And similar to sustainability strategy, we plan to reach out to certain representatives such as the OECD for quotes when we release a press release and subsequent launch on the social media platforms such as LinkedIn. The task force has kindly volunteered to participate in 2 global webinars that we plan to have in May. And we plan for that to be a month after the launch of the final pronouncement, so that we can achieve 2 objectives. First of all, to educate our stakeholders in terms of some of the board decisions, how we come about, where we landed in some of the decisions, if some of them haven't been following us throughout the journey. And the second of all, to have a Q&A session where we'll be able to answer some of the burning questions that our stakeholders will have, and those questions will form as part of the staff FAQ that we plan to develop towards May. In June, we have plans to record videos in native languages featuring board members, and we're working on the questions that we like to pose, so that's being worked on. And no doubt throughout the year, we have several outreach activities planned. So far, we know that Gabriel and Ken will be in Toronto in April, in Japan in April, and also in Australia in May, where they will have the opportunity to speak about these final pronouncements to our stakeholders. Next slide, please. At this point in time, I'll look to board members if they have feedback in terms of how we can promote the launch of the final pronouncements other than the usual channels that we have, and how you'll be able to contribute in sharing information of pre-existing events in your area. So Gabrielle, I hope I kept that under 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Carla. You did not need to rush. Sorry, so much. And it's important that we are all aware of the importance of this rollout plan. Thank you very much for putting this together. It's an important program, and it will involve some efforts from the staff and from the board. I'm very grateful for the task force for after the approval of the standards, and mostly to those who are not anymore board members for the contribution to make this happen. I need to recall that this maybe I don't need to recall. Everybody knows that this is a critical project and proposal and achievement of the IESBA on a very new space, with some risks along the way that we all know that we went through, some obstacles, some difficulties. So it only makes the achievement and the result more important. But it's not only about the process that we went through. We do what we have to do, and this is going to be like that all the time. It's about the impact, that the potential impact of these standards, mostly considering the current circumstances and situations. What we heard yesterday about farm culture and governance, all the presentations, by the way, in a direct or indirect way, but mostly the last one, makes this the importance and the urgency of having these standards rolled out and being adopted, implemented, applied, etc., more relevant than ever. So we did not know that they were going to be so timely, but fortunately we did it, and this is mostly due to the dedication and the focus and determination of the task force, of the staff supporting the task force, Ken and Carla mostly, and of its the task force chair. So thank you to all of you. Comments on this rollout plan from the board, contributions, suggestions, questions. Christelle.
Sorry if I didn't catch something that was on the screen, but to what extent stakeholders like tax people, lawyers, etc., are helping, endorsing, communicating at the same time on what we deliver? Would it help? Is it already embedded in your plan?
Thank you, Christelle. I know you didn't miss it. We do have plans to reach out to stakeholders who previously we've been in a journey with us, especially those who attended a roundtable. So International Bar Association is a friend of the task force, and we very much welcome further engagement with them. So we're in the process of reaching out to see how far they'll be able to endorse our standard in terms of promoting. So it is under discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, and this is a very good question, because this is going to be, as I see it, a process. We can't forget that one of the burning platforms and strategic topics for the next strategic cycle is to make our standards, if possible, when possible, and appropriate, applicable to others. And this question with respect to the tax, well, we have discussed this many times here. Jens Paul has many times raised this question and this evidence, that this would be useful for others, and it would be useful for the public interest to have all of them abiding by the same standards. So the story, it's the same. We can't forget that this is our strategic, one of our strategic goals for the next strategic cycle. So I think that this will evolve as we go. As Carlos said, we are starting to reach to other stakeholders. The question, if it would be useful to have them supporting our standards, of course, but with a view that they should be supporting the standards to be used to themselves. So not only for the others. So this is something that we will have to work upon, but surely a line of work for us. Carla.
Apologies. I wanted to add as well. I don't want to steal their thunder, but Bruce will be assisting us for reaching out to some of the media opportunities. So that channel as well is very important for us to disseminate the story of the board in terms of the final pronouncements to stakeholders that we haven't been able to reach out to.
Yeah, that's truth, and I think at Brunswick, I don't know, but we'll touch upon this. But this is one of the areas where we probably need more help in trying to enlarge the scope and the audience, because there are many, and we are not that close to them. So it's going to be important. I thought that I saw you, Laurie, but maybe no, you did not want to speak. Is there anyone else? Vanya, please.
Yes, I would like to congratulate the task force for concluding the project. I think it's a very important one. And as Brazil was very active during the period of consulting, I would recommend to consider the region, the Brazilian region, for one of the webinars. And also I'm chairing the Latin America Association of United Nations this year. And maybe we can use one of the meetings in order to spread the knowledge about this new project. It will be very welcome. Okay.
Thank you very much, Vanya. You will become a full-time board member very soon. With all the initiatives in which you are involved and taking forward. Thank you very much for that. Any other comments? Okay, Robert, sorry.
Thank you, Gabriella. I can't see the room, so I'm assuming there are no other comments, and I can just come in with a brief observation remark at the end of this. First of all, just to say that I'm very pleased to see the progress that's been made on this since I was last with the board a year ago as an observer. Congratulations, Jens, for leading the work, and nice to see Sanjeev on the call as well. Of course, as Carla mentioned, the certification of the standard is still on the agenda of the PIOB. We're meeting in a couple of weeks, and it's on the agenda there. So I can't say much more about that, obviously. But just in relation to the rollout, the key question really is going to be to communicate the nature of the changes in a way which will enable the board in due course to assess whether the changes will achieve the intended changes of behaviour of professional accountants as envisaged right from the outset. And so, of course, I take the point, Gabriella, that this is it remains a key project in the strategic work plan, and there'll be a need for a post-implementation review at the appropriate time. Once the changes are in place. And just to underline the point that was made just before about the changes being addressed only at professional accountants, we've had the discussion right along, haven't we, about the importance of ensuring that there's take-up of parallel initiative among other members of the tax advisory community, in particular lawyers, and it's good to hear that the board is still thinking about that as a strategic part of this rollout. And just one other point just to make, really joining some dots with the session yesterday, I think. There's some context that seems to be important here in the communication of these changes. The relationship with other foundational elements of the code is important. Fundamental principles, role and mindset, obviously. The NAS provisions, when I talk about these changes in my own personal outreach as a PIOB board member, there's often confusion between what these changes are about and the NAS provisions when the client is the auditor. So I think it's going to be important, Carla, to ensure that there's clarity around that. And then indeed, the extant provisions in the code, which you explained yesterday, relating to firm culture and governance, and indeed NOCLAR, because as was discussed with the ATO yesterday, things can go wrong in the tax area, and doubtless they'll continue to go wrong even with the benefit of these changes in major tax schemes. So it's important for the board, I think, to keep thinking about the mechanisms that are already there and to be able to communicate those, the mechanisms that are already there, to ensure that those scenarios that were discussed in the ATO session yesterday enable there to be action taken to identify risks at an early stage, bring them to the governance structure of the firm, etc. And so, of course, that work on culture and governance is going to continue into the future. But I thought it might just be useful to draw attention to those, because I think that's, if we think of the public interest in the overarching sense, I think it's very important to see all of this as an integrated set of changes. But thank you for the opportunity to comment, and again, very pleased to see the project having got to this point, and I hope we'll be able to have some news for you after the PIOB meeting in a couple of weeks. Thank you, Gabriella.
Thank you, Robert. We also hope that we have those good news, and of course, this all is subject to the certification. I had already mentioned that yesterday, but it's never too much to recall that there is still a step to go, which is the PIOB pronouncement about on the standards. So thank you also for the advice and the vision. This is very helpful, and I would say, Robert, on top of what you have said, that this demonstrates that what the IESBA is doing is consistently going in some direction. This means that we are not working in silos. We are not just adding projects on projects upon projects. We are working consistently towards a vision, and that the two burning platforms are strategic topics that we identified for the next strategic cycle, which is firm culture and governance, and expanding the impact of the code, the tax planning project, sustainability. They all at some point connect and make sense, are meaningful to serve this vision that we chose for ourselves. So this is fine, and this is I think important to provide robustness and meaningfulness to what we do. Before we close, I'd like to know if Jens, who has been driving this fast train for 2 years and a half or 3 years, I don't know anymore, wants to say anything, which is not going to be the last word, but.
No, thank you, Gabriella. Thank you, Robert. And I think we are looking forward for the certification and to start the outreach activity. Then I can assure you that it's not only the profession, the accountancy profession, which is interested. I'm just here in Brussels, and you know that here's a huge discussion on tax service providers, which is a term. So it is possible and hopeful that we can spread the standards also to others. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much, Jens. And just for you to know, Ken and I met with the European Commission, the tax division, 1 month ago, and it was very clear that this is what they are looking for. Again, a response that it's not only a response to the professional services, but to the service itself. It's a similar approach. And what they said is that we put our proposals on hold, but we will restart again in some time now. The last word about Vanya's kind suggestion to connect us with the United Nations. Of course, this is per se extremely relevant, more relevant when we know that the OECD and the UN are somehow trying to find how to the role of each other in this area of tax. So being connected with both and trying to see what the evolutions are in this area, in this space at the international level is going to be extremely important for the next steps. And with this, I don't see anyone else. So thank you very much again to the task force, Carla, for your presentation, the task force, all the members for the incredible work done, and we hope to see you very soon in other fora for the rollout plan. Thank you very much. So with this, we will move to the next topic in our agenda, or the next session. And the next session is the executive session. So it is a restricted session. Can you
yes,
make
thank you,
the
Gabriel.
rules clear?
Yes, absolutely. Just want to make sure that asked you if you could confirm the public observer